Chapter 36 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Howard's End by E.M. Forster. Chapter 36. "Margaret, you look upset," said Henry. Mansbridge had followed. Crane was at the gate, and the flyman had stood up on the box. Margaret shook her head at them. She could not speak any more. She remained clutching the keys, as if all their future depended on them. Henry was asking more questions. She shook her head again. His words had no sense. She heard him wonder why she had let Helen in. "You might have given me a knock with the gate," was another of his remarks. Presently she heard herself speaking. She, or someone for her, said, "Go away." Henry came nearer. He repeated, "Margaret, you look upset again. My dear, give me the keys. What are you doing with Helen?" "Oh, dearest, do go away, and I will manage it all." "Manage what?" He stretched out his hand for the keys. She might have obeyed if it had not been for the doctor. "Stop that, at least," she said piteously. The doctor had turned back and was questioning the driver of Helen's cab. A new feeling came over her. She was fighting for women against men. She did not care about rights, but if men came into Howard's End, it should be over her body. "Come, this is an odd beginning," said her husband. The doctor came forward now, and whispered 2 words to Mr. Wilcox. The scandal was out. Sincerely horrified, Henry stood gazing at the earth. "I cannot help it," said Margaret. "Do wait. It's not my fault. Please, all 4 of you, to go away now." Now the flyman was whispering to Crane. "We are relying on you to help us, Mrs. Wilcox," said the young doctor. "Could you go in and persuade your sister to come out?" "On what grounds?" said Margaret, suddenly looking him straight in the eyes. Thinking it professional to prevaricate, he murmured something about a nervous breakdown. "I beg your pardon, but it is nothing of the sort. You are not qualified to attend my sister, Mr. Mansbridge. If we require your services, we will let you know." "I can diagnose the case more bluntly, if you wish," he retorted. "You could, but you have not. You are, therefore, not qualified to attend my sister." "Come, come, Margaret," said Henry, never raising his eyes. "This is a terrible business, an appalling business. It's doctor's orders. Open the door." "Forgive me, but I will not." "I don't agree." Margaret was silent. "This business is as broad as it is long," contributed the doctor. "We had better all work together. You need us, Mrs. Wilcox, and we need you." "Quite so," said Henry. "I do not need you in the least," said Margaret. The 2 men looked at each other anxiously. "No more does my sister, who is still many weeks from her confinement." "Margaret, Margaret!" "Well, Henry, send your doctor away. What possible use is he now?" Mr. Wilcox ran his eye over the house. He had a vague feeling that he must stand firm and support the doctor. He himself might need support, for there was trouble ahead. "It all turns on affection now," said Margaret. "Affection, don't you see?" Resuming her usual methods, she wrote the word on the house with her finger. "Surely you see. I like Helen very much. You not so much. Mr. Mansbridge doesn't know her. That's all. And affection, when reciprocated, gives rights. Put that down in your notebook, Mr. Mansbridge. It's a useful formula." Henry told her to be calm. "You don't know what you want yourselves," said Margaret, folding her arms. "For one sensible remark I will let you in, but you cannot make it. You would trouble my sister for no reason. I will not permit it. I'll stand here all the day sooner." "Mansbridge," said Henry in a low voice, "perhaps not now." The pack was breaking up. At a sign from his master, Crane also went back into the car. "Now, Henry, you," she said gently. None of her bitterness had been directed at him. "Go away now, dear. I shall want your advice later, no doubt. Forgive me if I have been cross. But seriously, you must go." He was too stupid to leave her. Now it was Mr. Mansbridge who called in a low voice to him. "I shall soon find you down at Dolly's," she called, as the gate at last clanged between them. The fly moved out of the way, the motor backed, turned a little, backed again, and turned in the narrow road. A string of farm carts came up in the middle, but she waited through all, for there was no hurry. When all was over and the car had started, she opened the door. "Oh, my darling," she said, "my darling, forgive me." Helen was standing in the hall. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Howard's End, by E. M. Forster. Chapter 37. Margaret bolted the door on the inside. Then she would have kissed her sister, but Helen, in a dignified voice that came strangely from her, said, "Convenient. You did not tell me that the books were unpacked. I have found nearly everything that I want." "I told you nothing that was true." "It has been a great surprise, certainly. Has Aunt Julie been ill?" "Helen, you wouldn't think I'd invent that." "I suppose not," said Helen, turning away and crying a very little. "But one loses faith in everything after this." "We thought it was illness, but even then, I haven't behaved worthily." Helen selected another book. "I ought not to have consulted anyone. What would our father have thought of me?" She did not think of questioning her sister, nor of rebuking her. Both might be necessary in the future, but she had first to purge a greater crime than any that Helen could have committed, that want of confidence that is the work of the devil. "Yes, I am annoyed," replied Helen. "My wishes should have been respected. I would have gone through this meeting if it was necessary, but after Aunt Julie recovered it was not necessary. Planning my life, as I now have to do—" "Come away from those books," called Margaret. "Helen, do talk to me." "I was just saying that I have stopped living haphazard. One can't go through a great deal of—" she missed out the noun, "without planning one's actions in advance. I am going to have a child in June, and in the first place conversations, discussions, excitement, are not good for me. I will go through them if necessary, but only then. In the second place, I have no right to trouble people. I cannot fit in with England as I know it. I have done something that the English never pardon. It would not be right for them to pardon it. So I must live where I am not known." "But why didn't you tell me, dearest?" "Yes," replied Helen judicially, "I might have, but decided to wait." "I believe you would never have told me." "Oh, yes, I should. We have taken a flat in Munich." Margaret glanced out of window. "By we, I mean myself and Monica. But for her, I am, and have been, and always wish to be, alone." "I have not heard of Monica." "You wouldn't have. She's an Italian, by birth at least. She makes her living by journalism. I met her originally on Garda. Monica is much the best person to see me through." "You are very fond of her, then?" "She has been extraordinarily sensible with me." Margaret guessed at Monica's type. Italiano Inglesiato, they had named it, the crude feminist of the South, whom one respects but avoids, and Helen had turned to it in her need. "You must not think that we shall never meet," said Helen, with a measured kindness. "I shall always have a room for you when you can be spared, and the longer that you can be with me the better. But you haven't understood yet, Meg, and of course it is very difficult for you. This is a shock to you. It isn't to me, who have been thinking over our futures for many months, and they won't be changed by a slight contretemps such as this. I cannot live in England." "Helen, you've not forgiven me for my treachery. You couldn't talk like this to me if you had." "Oh, Meg, dear, why do we talk at all?" She dropped a book and sighed wearily. Then, recovering herself, she said, "Tell me, how is it that all the books are down here?" "A series of mistakes." "And a great deal of the furniture has been unpacked." "All." "Who lives here, then?" "No one." "I suppose you are letting it, though." "The house is dead," said Margaret, with a frown. "Why worry on about it?" "But I'm interested. You talk as if I had lost all my interest in life. I am still Helen, I hope. Now, this hasn't the feel of a dead house. The hall seems more alive even than in the old days, when it held the Wilcoxes' own things." "Interested, are you? Very well, I must tell you, I suppose. My husband lent it on condition but by a mistake all our things were unpacked, and Miss Avery, instead of—" She stopped. "Look here, I can't go on like this. I warn you I won't. Helen, why should you be so miserably unkind to me, simply because you hate Henry?" "I don't hate him now," said Helen. "I have stopped being a schoolgirl, and, Meg, once again, I'm not being unkind. But as for fitting in with your English life, no, put it out of your head at once. Imagine a visit from me at Ducie Street. It's unthinkable." Margaret could not contradict her. It was appalling to see her quietly moving forward with her plans, not bitter or excitable, neither asserting innocence nor confessing guilt, merely desiring freedom and the company of those who would not blame her. She had been through—how much? Margaret did not know. But it was enough to part her from old habits as well as old friends. "Tell me about yourself," said Helen, who had chosen her books and was lingering over the furniture. "There's nothing to tell." "But your marriage has been happy, Meg." "Yes, but I don't feel inclined to talk." "You feel as I do." "Not that, but I can't." "No more can I. It is a nuisance, but no good trying." Something had come between them. Perhaps it was society, which henceforward would exclude Helen. Perhaps it was a third life, already potent as a spirit. They could find no meeting place. Both suffered acutely, and were not comforted by the knowledge that affection survived. "Look here, Meg, is the coast clear?" "You mean that you want to go away from me?" "I suppose so." "Dear old lady, it isn't any use. I knew we should have nothing to say. Give my love to Aunt Julie and Tibby, and take more yourself than I can say. Promise to come and see me in Munich later." "Certainly, dearest." "For that is all we can do." It seemed so. Most ghastly of all was Helen's common sense. Monica had been extraordinarily good for her. "I am glad to have seen you and the things." She looked at the bookcase lovingly, as if she was saying farewell to the past. Margaret unbolted the door. She remarked, "The car has gone, and here's your cab." She led the way to it, glancing at the leaves and the sky. The spring had never seemed more beautiful. The driver, who was leaning on the gate, called out, "Please, lady, a message," and handed her Henry's visiting card through the bars. "How did this come?" she asked. Crane had returned with it almost at once. She read the card with annoyance. It was covered with instructions in domestic French. When she and her sister had talked, she was to come back for the night to Dolly's. Il faut dormir sur ce sujet. while Helen was to be found une confortable chambre à l'hôtel. The final sentence displeased her greatly, until she remembered that the Charleses had only one spare room, and so could not invite a third guest. "Henry would have done what he could," she interpreted. Helen had not followed her into the garden. The door once open, she lost her inclination to fly. She remained in the hall, going from bookcase to table. She grew more like the old Helen, irresponsible and charming. "This is Mr. Wilcox's house?" she inquired. "Surely you remember Howard's End?" "Remember? I, who remember everything. But it looks to be ours now." "Miss Avery was extraordinary," said Margaret, her own spirits lightening a little. Again she was invaded by a slight feeling of disloyalty. But it brought her relief, and she yielded to it. "She loved Mrs. Wilcox, and would rather furnish her house with our things than think of it empty. In consequence, here are all the library books." "Not all the books. She hasn't unpacked the art books, in which she may show her sense. And we never used to have the sword here. The sword looks well, though." "Magnificent." "Yes, doesn't it? Where's the piano, Meg?" "I warehoused that in London." "Why?" "Nothing." "Curious, too, that the carpet fits." "The carpet's a mistake," announced Helen. "I know that we had it in London, but this floor ought to be bare. It is far too beautiful." "You still have a mania for underfurnishing. Would you care to come into the dining room before you start? There's no carpet there." They went in, and each minute their talk became more natural. "Oh, what a place for Mother Chiffonnier!" cried Helen. "Look at the chairs, though." "Oh, look at them." Wickham Place faced north, didn't it? "Northwest." "Anyhow, it is 30 years since any of those chairs have felt the sun. Feel, their little backs are quite warm." "But why has Miss Avery made them set to partners? I shall just— Over here, Meg. Put it so that anyone sitting will see the lawn." Margaret moved a chair. Helen sat down in it. "Yes." "The window's too high." "Try a drawing-room chair." "No, I don't like the drawing-room so much. The beam has been matchboarded. It would have been so beautiful otherwise." "Helen, what a memory you have for some things. You're perfectly right. It's a room that men have spoilt through trying to make it nice for women. Men don't know what we want." "And never will." "I don't agree. In 2000 years they'll know." "But the chairs show up wonderfully. Look where Tibby spilt the soup." "Coffee. It was coffee, surely." Helen shook her head. "Impossible. Tibby was far too young to be given coffee at that time." "Was father alive?" "Yes." "Then you're right, and it must have been soup. I was thinking of much later, that unsuccessful visit of Aunt Julie's, when she didn't realize that Tibby had grown up. It was coffee then, for he threw it down on purpose. There was some rhyme, tea, coffee, coffee, tea, that she said to him every morning at breakfast. Wait a minute, how did it go?" "I know. No, I don't. What a detestable boy Tibby was!" "But the rhyme was simply awful. No decent person could have put up with it." "Ah, that greengage tree!" cried Helen, as if the garden was also part of their childhood. "Why do I connect it with dumbbells? And there come the chickens. The grass wants cutting. I love yellowhammers." Margaret interrupted her. "I have got it," she announced. "Tea, tea, coffee, tea, or chocolarity. That every morning for 3 weeks. No wonder Tibby was wild." "Tibby is moderately a dear now," said Helen. "There, I knew you'd say that in the end. Of course he's a dear." A bell rang. "Listen, what's that?" Helen said, "Perhaps the Wilcoxes are beginning the siege." What nonsense! Listen." And the triviality faded from their faces, though it left something behind, the knowledge that they could never be parted because their love was rooted in common things. Explanations and appeals had failed. They had tried for a common meeting ground, and had only made each other unhappy. And all the time their salvation was lying round them, the past sanctifying the present with wild heart-throb, declaring that there would after all be a future, with laughter and the voices of children. Helen, still smiling, came up to her sister. She said, "It is always Meg." They looked into each other's eyes. The inner life had paid. Solemnly the clapper tolled. No one was in the front. Margaret went to the kitchen and struggled between packing cases to the window. Their visitor was only a little boy with a tin can, and triviality returned. "Little boy, what do you want?" "Please, I am the milk." "Did Miss Avery send you?" said Margaret, rather sharply. "Yes, please." "Then take it back, and say we require no milk." While she called to Helen, "No, it's not the siege, but possibly an attempt to provision us against one." "But I like milk," cried Helen. "Why send it away?" "Do you? Oh, very well. But we've nothing to put it in, and he wants the can." "Please, I'm to call in the morning for the can," said the boy. "The house will be locked up then." "In the morning would I bring eggs too?" "Are you the boy whom I saw playing in the stacks last week?" The child hung his head. "Well, run away and do it again." "Nice little boy," whispered Helen. "I say, what's your name?" "Mine's Helen." "Tom." That was Helen all over. The Wilcoxes, too, would ask a child its name, but they never told their names in return. "Tom, this one here is Margaret. And at home we've another called Tibby." "Mine are Lopbeard," replied Tom, supposing Tibby to be a rabbit. "You are a very good and rather clever little boy. Mind you come again." "Isn't he charming?" "Undoubtedly," said Margaret. "He is probably the son of Madge, and Madge is dreadful." "But this place has wonderful powers." "What do you mean?" "I don't know, because I probably agree with you." "It kills what is dreadful, and makes what is beautiful live." "I do agree," said Helen, as she sipped the milk. "But you said that the house was dead not half an hour ago." "Meaning that I was dead. I felt it." "Yes, the house has a surer life than we, even if it was empty. And as it is, I can't get over that for 30 years the sun has never shone full on our furniture. After all, Wickham Place was a grave." "Meg, I've a startling idea." "What is it?" "Drink some milk to steady you." Margaret obeyed. "No, I won't tell you yet," said Helen, "because you may laugh or be angry. Let's go upstairs first, and give the rooms an airing." They opened window after window, till the inside, too, was rustling to the spring. Curtains blew, picture frames tapped cheerfully. Helen uttered cries of excitement as she found this bed obviously in its right place, that in its wrong one. She was angry with Miss Avery for not having moved the wardrobes up. Then one would see, really. She admired the view. She was the Helen who had written the memorable letters 4 years ago. As they leant out looking westward, she said, "About my idea. Couldn't you and I camp out in this house for the night?" "I don't think we could well do that," said Margaret. "Here are beds, tables, towels." "I know, but the house isn't supposed to be slept in, and Henry's suggestion was—" "I require no suggestions. I shall not alter anything in my plans. But it would give me so much pleasure to have one night here with you. It will be something to look back on." "Oh, Meg, lovey, do let's." "But Helen, my pet," said Margaret, We can't without getting Henry's leave. Of course he would give it, but you said yourself that you couldn't visit at Ducie Street now, and this is equally intimate. Ducie Street is his house. This is ours. Our furniture, our sort of people coming to the door. Do let us camp out, just one night, and Tom shall feed us on eggs and milk. Why not? It's a moon. Margaret hesitated. I feel Charles wouldn't like it, she said at last. Even our furniture annoyed him, and I was going to clear it out when Aunt Julie's illness prevented me. I sympathize with Charles. He feels it's his mother's house. He loves it in rather an untaking way. Henry I could answer for, not Charles. I know he won't like it, said Helen, but I am going to pass out of their lives. What difference will it make in the long run if they say, and she even spent the night at Howard's End? How do you know you'll pass out of their lives? We have thought that twice before. Because my plans, which you change in a moment. Then because my life is great and theirs are little, said Helen, taking fire. I know of things they can't know of, and so do you. We know that there's poetry. We know that there's death. They can only take them on hearsay. We know that this is our house, because it feels ours. Oh, they may take the title deeds and the door keys, but for this one night we are at home. It would be lovely to have you once more alone, said Margaret. It may be a chance in 1,000. Yes, and we could talk. She dropped her voice. It won't be a very glorious story. But under that wych-elm, honestly, I see little happiness ahead. Cannot I have this one night with you? I needn't say how much it would mean to me. Then let us. It is no good hesitating. Shall I drive down to Hilton now and get leave? Oh, we don't want leave. But Margaret was a loyal wife. In spite of imagination and poetry, perhaps on account of them, she could sympathize with the technical attitude that Henry would adopt. If possible, she would be technical too. A night's lodging, and they demanded no more, need not involve the discussion of general principles. Charles may say no, grumbled Helen. We shan't consult him. Go if you like. I should have stopped without leave. It was the touch of selfishness, which was not enough to mar Helen's character, and even added to its beauty. She would have stopped without leave, and escaped to Germany the next morning. Margaret kissed her. Expect me back before dark. I am looking forward to it so much. It is like you to have thought of such a beautiful thing. Not a thing, only an ending, said Helen rather sadly, and the sense of tragedy closed in on Margaret again as soon as she left the house. She was afraid of Miss Avery. It is disquieting to fulfill a prophecy, however superficially. She was glad to see no watching figure as she drove past the farm, but only little Tom, turning somersaults. Chapter 38 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Howard's End by E. M. Forster. Chapter 38. The tragedy began quietly enough, and like many another talk, by the man's deft assertion of his superiority. Henry heard her arguing with the driver, stepped out and settled the fellow, who was inclined to be rude, and then led the way to some chairs on the lawn. Dolly, who had not been told, ran out with offers of tea. He refused them, and ordered her to wheel baby's perambulator away, as they desired to be alone. "But the Diddums can't listen. He isn't 9 months old," she pleaded. "That's not what I was saying," retorted her father-in-law. Baby was wheeled out of earshot, and did not hear about the crisis till later years. It was now the turn of Margaret. "Is it what we feared?" he asked. "It is." "Dear girl," he began, "there is a troublesome business ahead of us, and nothing but the most absolute honesty and plain speech will see us through." Margaret bent her head. "I'm obliged to question you on subjects we'd both prefer to leave untouched. As you know, I am not one of your Bernard Shaws who consider nothing sacred. To speak as I must will pain me, but there are occasions. We are husband and wife, not children. I am a man of the world, and you are a most exceptional woman." All Margaret's senses forsook her. She blushed and looked past him at the 6 hills, covered with spring herbage. Noting her color, he grew still more kind. "I see that you feel as I felt when— My poor little wife. Oh, be brave. Just 1 or 2 questions, and I have done with you. Was your sister wearing a wedding ring?" Margaret stammered a "No." There was an appalling silence. "Henry, I really came to ask a favor about Howard's End." "One point at a time. I am now obliged to ask for the name of her seducer." She rose to her feet and held the chair between them. Her color had ebbed, and she was gray. It did not displease him that she should receive his question thus. "Take your time," he counseled her. "Remember that this is far worse for me than for you." She swayed. He feared she was going to faint. Then speech came, and she said slowly, "Seducer? No, I do not know her seducer's name." "Would she not tell you?" "I never even asked her who seduced her," said Margaret, dwelling on the hateful word thoughtfully. "That is singular." Then he changed his mind. "Natural, perhaps, dear girl, that you shouldn't ask. But until his name is known, nothing can be done. Sit down. How terrible it is to see you so upset. I knew you weren't fit for it. I wish I hadn't taken you." Margaret answered, "I like to stand, if you don't mind, for it gives me a pleasant view of the 6 hills." "As you like." "Have you anything else to ask me, Henry?" "Next, you must tell me whether you have gathered anything. I have often noticed your insight, dear. I only wish my own was as good. You may have guessed something, even though your sister said nothing. The slightest hint would help us." "Who is we?" "I thought it best to ring up Charles." "That was unnecessary," said Margaret, growing warmer. "This news will give Charles disproportionate pain." "He has at once gone to call on your brother." "That, too, was unnecessary." "Let me explain, dear, how the matter stands. You don't think that I and my son are other than gentlemen. It is in Helen's interests that we are acting. It is still not too late to save her name." Then Margaret hit out for the first time. "Are we to make a seducer marry her?" she asked. "If possible, yes." "But, Henry, suppose he turned out to be married already? One has heard of such cases." "In that case he must pay heavily for his misconduct, and be thrashed within an inch of his life." So her first blow missed. She was thankful of it. What had tempted her to imperil both of their lives? Henry's obtuseness had saved her as well as himself. Exhausted with anger, she sat down again, blinking at him as he told her as much as he thought fit. At last she said, "May I ask you my question now?" "Certainly, my dear." "Tomorrow Helen goes to Munich." "Well, possibly she is right." "Henry, let a lady finish. Tomorrow she goes. Tonight, with your permission, she would like to sleep at Howard's End." It was the crisis of his life. Again she would have recalled the words as soon as they were uttered. She had not led up to them with sufficient care. She longed to warn him that they were far more important than he supposed. She saw him weighing them, as if they were a business proposition. "Why Howard's End?" he said at last. "Would she not be more comfortable, as I suggested, at the hotel?" Margaret hastened to give him reasons. "It is an odd request, but you know what Helen is, and what women in her state are." He frowned and moved irritably. "She has the idea that one night in your house would give her pleasure and do her good. I think she's right. Being one of those imaginative girls, the presence of all our books and furniture soothes her. This is a fact. It is the end of her girlhood. Her last words to me were, 'A beautiful ending.'" "She values the old furniture for sentimental reasons, in fact." "Exactly. You have quite understood. It is her last hope of being with it." "I don't agree there, my dear. Helen will have her share of the goods wherever she goes, possibly more than her share, for you are so fond of her that you'd give her anything of yours that she fancies, wouldn't you? And I'd raise no objection. I could understand it, if it was her old home, because a home, or a house—" he changed the word designedly. He had thought of a telling point. "Because a house in which one has lived becomes in a sort of way sacred. I don't know why. Associations and so on. Now, Helen has no associations with Howard's End, though I and Charles and Evie have. I do not see why she wants to stay the night there. She will only catch cold." "Leave it that you don't see," cried Margaret. "Call it fancy. But realize that fancy is a scientific fact. Helen is fanciful, and wants to." Then he surprised her, a rare occurrence. He shot an unexpected bolt. "If she wants to sleep one night, she may want to sleep two. We shall never get her out of the house, perhaps." "Well," said Margaret, with the precipice in sight, "and suppose we don't get her out of the house? Would it matter? She would do no one any harm." Again the irritated gesture. "No, Henry," she panted, receding. "I didn't mean that. We will only trouble Howard's End for this one night. I take her to London tomorrow." "Do you intend to sleep in a damp house, too?" "She cannot be left alone." "That's quite impossible. Madness. You must be here to meet Charles." "I have already told you that your message to Charles was unnecessary, and I have no desire to meet him." "Margaret, my Margaret, what has this business to do with Charles? If it concerns me little, it concerns you less, and Charles not at all." "As the future owner of Howard's End," said Mr. Wilcox, arching his fingers, "I should say that it did concern Charles." "In what way? Will Helen's condition depreciate the property?" "My dear, you are forgetting yourself." "I think you yourself recommended plain speaking." They looked at each other in amazement. The precipice was at their feet now. "Helen commands my sympathy," said Henry. "As your husband, I shall do all for her that I can, and I have no doubt that she will prove more sinned against than sinning. But I cannot treat her as if nothing has happened. I should be false to my position in society if I did." She controlled herself for the last time. "No, let us go back to Helen's request," she said. "It is unreasonable, but the request of an unhappy girl. Tomorrow she will go to Germany, and trouble society no longer. Tonight she asks to sleep in your empty house, a house which you do not care about, and which you have not occupied for over a year. May she? Will you give my sister leave? Will you forgive her, as you hope to be forgiven, and as you have actually been forgiven? Forgive her for one night only. That will be enough." "As I have actually been forgiven?" "Never mind for the moment what I mean by that," said Margaret. "Answer my question." Perhaps some hint of her meaning did dawn on him. If so, he blotted it out. Straight from his fortress he answered, "I seem rather unaccommodating, but I have some experience of life, and know how one thing leads to another. I am afraid that your sister had better sleep at the hotel. I have my children and the memory of my dear wife to consider.
I am sorry, but see that she leaves my house at once."
"You mentioned Mrs. Wilcox."
"I beg your pardon?"
"A rare occurrence. In reply, may I mention Mrs. Bast?"
"You have not been yourself all day," said Henry, and rose from his seat with face unmoved. Margaret rushed at him and seized both his hands. She was transfigured. "Not any more of this," she cried. "You shall see the connection if it kills you, Henry. You have had a mistress. I forgave you. My sister has a lover. You drive her from the house. Do you see the connection? Stupid, hypocritical, cruel, oh, contemptible! A man who insults his wife when she's alive and cants with her memory when she's dead. A man who ruins a woman for his pleasure, and casts her off to ruin other men, and gives bad financial advice, and then says he is not responsible. These, man, are you. You can't recognize them, because you cannot connect. I've had enough of your unweeded kindness. I've spoilt you long enough. All your life you have been spoiled. Mrs. Wilcox spoiled you. No one has ever told you what you are. Muddled, criminally muddled. Men like you use repentance as a blind, so don't repent. Only say to yourself, what Helen has done, I've done." The two cases are different,"
Henry stammered. His real retort was not quite ready. His brain was still in a whirl, and he wanted a little longer. "In what way different? You have betrayed Mrs. Wilcox, Helen only herself. You remain in society. Helen can't. You have had only pleasure. She may die. You have the insolence to talk to me of differences, Henry." Oh, the uselessness of it. Henry's retort came.
"I perceive you are attempting blackmail. It is scarcely a pretty weapon for a wife to use against her husband. My rule through life has been never to pay the least attention to threats, and I can only repeat what I said before. I do not give you and your sister leave to sleep at Howard's End."
Margaret loosed his hands. He went into the house, wiping first one and then the other on his handkerchief. For a little she stood looking at the 6 hills, tombs of warriors, breasts of Chapter 39 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Howard's End by E. M. Forster. Chapter 39. Charles and Tibby met at Ducie Street, where the latter was staying. Their interview was short and absurd. They had nothing in common but the English language, and tried by its help to express what neither of them understood. Charles saw in Helen the family foe. He had singled her out as the most dangerous of the Schlegels, and angry as he was, looked forward to telling his wife how right he had been. His mind was made up at once. The girl must be got out of the way before she disgraced them farther. If occasion offered, she might be married to a villain, or, possibly, to a fool. But this was a concession to morality. It formed no part of his main scheme. Honest and hearty was Charles's dislike, and the past spread itself out very clearly before him. Hatred is a skillful compositor. As if they were heads in a notebook, he ran through all the incidents of the Schlegels' campaign, the attempt to compromise his brother, his mother's legacy, his father's marriage, the introduction of the furniture, the unpacking of the same. He had not yet heard of the request to sleep at Howard's End. That was to be their master stroke and the opportunity for his. But he already felt that Howard's End was the objective, and, though he disliked the house, was determined to defend it. Tibby, on the other hand, had no opinions. He stood above the conventions. His sister had a right to do what she thought right. It is not difficult to stand above the conventions when we leave no hostages among them.
Men can always be more unconventional than women, and a bachelor of independent means need encounter no difficulties at all. Unlike Charles, Tibby had money enough. His ancestors had earned it for him, and if he shocked the people in one set of lodgings, he had only to move into another. His was the leisure without sympathy, an attitude as fatal as the strenuous. A little cold culture may be raised on it, but no art. His sisters had seen the family danger, and had never forgotten to discount the gold islets that raised them from the sea. Tibby gave all the praise to himself, and so despised the struggling and the submerged. Hence the absurdity of the interview. The gulf between them was economic as well as spiritual. But several facts passed. Charles pressed for them with an impertinence that the undergraduate could not withstand. On what date had Helen gone abroad? To whom? Charles was anxious to fasten the scandal on Germany. Then, changing his tactics, he said roughly, "I suppose you realize that you are your sister's protector." "In what sense?" "If a man played about with my sister, I'd send a bullet through him. But perhaps you don't mind." "I mind very much," protested Tibby. "Who do you suspect, then? Speak out, man. One always suspects someone." "No one. I don't think so." Involuntarily he blushed. He had remembered the scene in his Oxford rooms. "You are hiding something," said Charles. As interviews go, he got the best of this one. "When you saw her last, did she mention anyone's name? Yes or no?" he thundered, so that Tibby started. "In my room she mentioned some friends called the Basts." "Who are the Basts?"
Friends of hers at Evie's wedding."
"I don't remember."
"But by great Scott, I do.
My aunt told me about some tag-rag. Was she full of them when you saw her? Is there a man? Did she speak of the man? Or, look here, have you had any dealings with him?"
Tibby was silent. Without intending it, he had betrayed his sister's confidence. He was not enough interested in human life to see where things will lead to. He had a strong regard for honesty, and his word, once given, had always been kept up to now. He was deeply vexed, not only for the harm he had done Helen, but for the flaw he had discovered in his own equipment.
"I see. You are in his confidence. They met at your rooms. Oh, what a family! What a family! God help the poor pater."
And Tibby found himself Chapter 40 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Howard's End by E. M. Forster. Chapter 40. Leonard, he would figure at length in a newspaper report, but that evening he did not count for much. The foot of the tree was in shadow, since the moon was still hidden behind the house. But above, to right, to left, down the long meadow the moonlight was streaming. Leonard seemed not a man, but a cause. Perhaps it was Helen's way of falling in love, a curious way to Margaret, whose agony and whose contempt of Henry were yet imprinted with his image. Helen forgot people. They were husks that had enclosed her emotion. She could pity, or sacrifice herself, or have instincts, but had she ever loved in the noblest way, where man and woman, having lost themselves in sex, desire to lose sex itself in comradeship? Margaret wondered, but said no word of blame. This was Helen's evening. Troubles enough lay ahead of her, the loss of friends and of social advantages, the agony, the supreme agony of motherhood, which is even yet not a matter of common knowledge. For the present, let the moon shine brightly, and the breezes of the spring blow gently, dying away from the gale of the day,
and let the earth, who brings increase, bring peace. Not even to herself dare she blame Helen. She could not assess her trespass by any moral code. It was everything or nothing. Morality can tell us that murder is worse than stealing, and group most sins in an order all must approve, but it cannot group Helen. The surer its pronouncements on this point, the surer may we be that morality is not speaking. Christ was evasive when they questioned him. It is those that cannot connect who hasten to cast the first stone. This was Helen's evening, one at what cost, and not to be marred by the sorrows of others. Of her own tragedy, Margaret never uttered a word. "One isolates," said Helen slowly. "I isolated Mr. Wilcox from the other forces that were pulling Leonard downhill. Consequently, I was full of pity, and almost of revenge. For weeks I had blamed Mr. Wilcox only, and so when your letters came—" "I need never have written them," sighed Margaret. "They never shielded Henry. How hopeless it is to tidy away the past, even for others." "I did not know that it was your own idea to dismiss the Basts." "Looking back, that was wrong of me." "Looking back, darling, I know that it was right. It is right to save the man whom one loves. I am less enthusiastic about justice now. But we both thought you wrote at his dictation. It seemed the last touch of his callousness. Being very much wrought up by this time, and Mrs. Bast was upstairs. I had not seen her, and had talked for a long time to Leonard. I had snubbed him for no reason, and that should have warned me I was in danger. So when the notes came, I wanted us to go to you for an explanation. He said that he guessed the explanation. He knew of it, and you mustn't know. I pressed him to tell me. He said no one must know, it was something to do with his wife. Right up to the end we were Mr. Bast and Miss Schlegel. I was going to tell him that he must be frank with me when I saw his eyes, and guessed that Mr. Wilcox had ruined him in 2 ways, not 1. I drew him to me. I made him tell me. I felt very lonely myself. He is not to blame. He would have gone on worshipping me. I want never to see him again, though it sounds appalling. I wanted to give him money and feel finished. Oh, Meg, the little that is known about these things." She laid her face against the tree. "The little, too, that is known about growth. Both times it was loneliness, and the night, and panic afterwards. Did Leonard grow out of Paul?" Margaret did not speak for a moment. So tired was she that her attention had actually wandered to the teeth that had been thrust into the tree's bark to medicate it. From where she sat she could see them gleam. She had been trying to count them. "Leonard is a better growth than madness," she said. "I was afraid that you would react against Paul until you went over the verge." "I did react until I found poor Leonard. I am steady now. I shan't ever like your Henry, dearest Meg, or even speak kindly about him, but all that blinding hate is over. I shall never rave against Wilcoxes any more. I understand how you married him, and you will now be very happy." Margaret did not reply. "Yes," repeated Helen, her voice growing more tender, "I do at last understand." "Except Mrs. Wilcox, dearest, no one understands our little movements." "Because in death—" "I agree." "Not quite. I feel that you and I and Henry are only fragments of that woman's mind. She knows everything. She is everything. She is the house, and the tree that leans over it. People have their own deaths as well as their own lives, and even if there is nothing beyond death, we shall differ in our nothingness. I cannot believe that knowledge such as hers will perish with knowledge such as mine. She knew about realities. She knew when people were in love, though she was not in the room. I don't doubt that she knew when Henry deceived her. "Good night, Mrs. Wilcox," called a voice. "Oh, good night, Miss Avery." "Why should Miss Avery work for us?" Helen murmured. "Why, indeed?" Miss Avery crossed the lawn and merged into the hedge that divided it from the farm. An old gap, which Mr. Wilcox had filled up, had reappeared, and her track through the dew followed the path that he had turfed over, when he improved the garden and made it possible for games. "This is not quite our house yet," said Helen. "When Miss Avery called, I felt we are only a couple of tourists." "We shall be that everywhere, and forever." "But affectionate tourists." "But tourists who pretend each hotel is their home." "I can't pretend very long," said Helen. "Sitting under this tree one forgets, but I know that tomorrow I shall see the moon rise out of Germany. Not all your goodness can alter the facts of the case. Unless you will come with me." Margaret thought for a moment. In the past year she had grown so fond of England that to leave it was a real grief. Yet what detained her? No doubt Henry would pardon her outburst, and go on blustering and muddling into a ripe old age. But what was the good? She had just as soon vanish from his mind. "Are you serious in asking me, Helen? Should I get on with your Monica?" "You would not, but I am serious in asking you." Still no more plans now, and no more reminiscences. They were silent for a little. It was Helen's evening. The present flowed by them like a stream. The tree rustled. It had made music before they were born, and would continue after their deaths, but its song was of the moment. The moment had passed. The tree rustled again. Their senses were sharpened, and they seemed to apprehend life. Life passed. The tree nestled again. "Sleep now," said Margaret. The peace of the country was entering into her. It has no commerce with memory, and little with hope. Least of all is it concerned with the hopes of the next 5 minutes. It is the peace of the present, which passes understanding. Its murmur came, now, and now once more as they trod the gravel, and now as the moonlight fell upon their father's sword. They passed upstairs, kissed, and amidst the endless iterations fell asleep. The house had enshadowed the tree at first, but as the moon rose higher the two disentangled, and were clear for a few moments at midnight. Margaret awoke and looked into the garden. How incomprehensible that Leonard Bast should have won her this night of peace. Was he also part of Mrs. Chapter 41 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Howard's End by E. M. Forster. Chapter 41. Far different was Leonard's development. The months after Oniton, whatever minor troubles they might bring him, were all overshadowed by remorse. When Helen looked back she could philosophize, or she could look into the future and plan for her child. But the father saw nothing beyond his own sin. Weeks afterwards, in the midst of other occupations, he would suddenly cry out, "Brute! You brute! I couldn't have!" and be rent into two people who held dialogues. Or brown rain would descend, blotting out faces and the sky. Even Jackie noticed the change in him. Most terrible were his sufferings when he awoke from sleep. Sometimes he was happy at first, but grew conscious of a burden hanging to him and weighing down his thoughts when they would move, or little iron scorched his body, or a sword stabbed him. He would sit at the edge of his bed, holding his heart and moaning, "Oh, what shall I do? Whatever shall I do?" Nothing brought ease. He could put distance between him and the trespass, but it grew in his soul. Remorse is not among the eternal verities. The Greeks were right to dethrone her. Her action is too capricious, as though the Erinyes selected for punishment only certain men and certain sins. And of all means to regeneration, remorse is surely the most wasteful. It cuts away healthy tissues with the poisoned. It is a knife that probes far deeper than the evil. Leonard was driven straight through its torments, and emerged pure but enfeebled, a better man, who would never lose control of himself again, but also a smaller, who had less to control. Nor did purity mean peace. The use of the knife can become a habit as hard to shake off as passion itself, and Leonard continued to start with a cry out of dreams. He built up a situation that was far enough from the truth. It never occurred to him that Helen was to blame. He forgot the intensity of their talk, the charm that had been lent him by sincerity, the magic of Oniton under darkness and of the whispering river. Helen loved the absolute. Leonard had been ruined absolutely, and had appeared to her as a man apart, isolated from the world. A real man who cared for adventure and beauty, who desired to live decently and pay his way, who could have traveled more gloriously through life than the juggernaut car that was crushing him. Memories of Evie's wedding had warped her, the starched servants, the yards of uneaten food, the rustle of overdressed women, motor cars oozing grease on the gravel, rubbish on a pretentious band. She had tasted the lees of this on her arrival. In the darkness, after failure, they intoxicated her. She and the victim seemed alone in a world of unreality, and she loved him absolutely, perhaps for half an hour. In the morning she was gone. The note that she left, tender and hysterical in tone, and intended to be most kind, hurt her lover terribly. It was as if some work of art had been broken by him, some picture in the National Gallery slashed out of its frame. When he recalled her talents and her social position, he felt that the first passer-by had a right to shoot him down. He was afraid of the waitress and the porters at the railway station. He was afraid at first of his wife, though later he was to regard her with a strange new tenderness and to think, "There is nothing to choose between us, after all." The expedition to Shropshire crippled the Basts permanently. Helen, in her flight, forgot to settle the hotel bill, and took their return tickets away with her. They had to pawn Jackie's bangles to get home, and the smash came a few days afterwards. It is true that Helen offered him £5,000, but such a sum meant nothing to him. He could not see that the girl was desperately righting herself, and trying to save something out of the disaster, if it was only £5,000. But he had to live somehow. He turned to his family, and degraded himself to a professional beggar. There was nothing else for him to do. "A letter from Leonard," thought Blanche, his sister, "and after all this time." She hid it, so that her husband should not see, and when he had gone to his work read it with some emotion, and sent the prodigal a little money out of her dress allowance. "A letter from Leonard," said the other sister, Laura, a few days later. She showed it to her husband. He wrote a cruel, insolent reply, but sent more money than Blanche, so Leonard soon wrote to him again. And during the winter the system was developed. Leonard realized that they need never starve, because it would be too painful for his relatives. Society is based on the family, and the clever wastrel can exploit this indefinitely. Without a generous thought on either side, pounds and pounds passed. The donors disliked Leonard, and he grew to hate them intensely. When Laura censured his immoral marriage, he thought bitterly, She minds that. What would she say if she knew the truth?" When Blanche's husband offered him work, he found some pretext for avoiding it. He had wanted work keenly at Oniton, but too much anxiety had shattered him; he was joining the unemployable. When his brother, the lay reader, did not reply to a letter, he wrote again, saying that he and Jacky would come down to his village on foot. He did not intend this as blackmail. Still, the brother sent a postal order, and it became part of the system. And so passed his winter and his spring. In the horror there are two bright spots. He never confused the past. He remained alive, and blessed are those who live, if it is only to a sense of sinfulness. The anodyne of muddledom, by which most men blur and blend their mistakes, never passed Leonard's lips. And if I drink oblivion of a day, so shorten I the stature of my soul. It is a hard saying, and a hard man wrote it, but it lies at the foot of all character. And the other bright spot was his tenderness for Jacky. He pitied her with nobility now, not the contemptuous pity of a man who sticks to a woman through thick and thin. He tried to be less irritable. He wondered what her hungry eyes desired, nothing that she could express, or that he or any man could give her. Would she ever receive the justice that is mercy, the justice for by-products that the world is too busy to bestow? She was fond of flowers, generous with money, and not revengeful. If she had borne him a child, he might have cared for her. Unmarried, Leonard would never have begged; he would have flickered out and died. But the whole of life is mixed. He had to provide for Jacky, and went down dirty paths that she might have a few feathers and dishes of food that suited her. One day he caught sight of Margaret and her brother. He was in St. Paul's. He had entered the cathedral partly to avoid the rain, and partly to see a picture that had educated him in former years. But the light was bad, the picture ill-placed, and time and judgment were inside him now. Death alone still charmed him, with her lap of poppies on which all men shall sleep. He took one glance, and turned aimlessly away towards a chair. Then down the nave he saw Miss Schlegel and her brother. They stood in the fairway of passengers, and their faces were extremely grave. He was perfectly certain that they were in trouble about their sister. Once outside, and he fled immediately, he wished that he had spoken to them. What was his life? What were a few angry words, or even imprisonment? He had done wrong. That was the true terror. Whatever they might know, he would tell them everything he knew. He re-entered St. Paul's, but they had moved in his absence, and had gone to lay their difficulties before Mr. Wilcox and Charles. The sight of Margaret turned remorse into new channels. He desired to confess, and though the desire is proof of a weakened nature, which is about to lose the essence of human intercourse, it did not take an ignoble form. He did not suppose that confession would bring him happiness. It was rather that he yearned to get clear of the tangle. So does the suicide yearn. The impulses are akin, and the crime of suicide lies rather in its disregard for the feelings of those whom we leave behind. Confession need harm no one; it can satisfy that test, and though it was un-English, and ignored by our Anglican cathedral, Leonard had a right to decide upon it. Moreover, he trusted Margaret. He wanted her hardness now. That cold, intellectual nature of hers would be just, if unkind. He would do whatever she told him, even if he had to see Helen. That was the supreme punishment she would exact. And perhaps she would tell him how Helen was. That was the supreme reward. He knew nothing about Margaret, not even whether she was married to Mr. Wilcox, and tracking her out took several days. That evening he toiled through the wet to Wickham Place, where the new flats were now appearing. Was he also the cause of their move? Were they expelled from society on his account? Thence to a public library, but could find no satisfactory Schlegel in the directory. On the morrow he searched again. He hung about outside Mr. Wilcox's office at lunch-time, and as the clerks came out, said, "Excuse me, sir, but is your boss married?" Most of them stared. Some said, "What's that to you?" But one, who had not yet acquired reticence, told him what he wished. Leonard could not learn the private address. That necessitated more trouble with directories and tubes. Ducie Street was not discovered till the Monday, the day that Margaret and her husband went down on their hunting expedition to Howard's End. He called at about 4 o'clock. The weather had changed, and the sun shone gaily on the ornamental steps, black and white marble in triangles. Leonard lowered his eyes to them after ringing the bell. He felt in curious health. Doors seemed to be opening and shutting inside his body, and he had been obliged to sleep sitting up in bed, with his back propped against the wall. When the parlor-maid came he could not see her face. The brown rain had descended suddenly. "Does Mrs. Wilcox live here?" he asked. "She's out," was the answer. "When will she be back?" "I'll ask," said the parlor-maid. Margaret had given instructions that no one who mentioned her name should ever be rebuffed. Putting the door on the chain, for Leonard's appearance demanded this, she went through to the smoking-room, which was occupied by Tibby. Tibby was asleep. He had had a good lunch. Charles Wilcox had not yet rung him up for the distracting interview. He said drowsily, "I don't know. Hilton. Howard's End. Who is it?" "I'll ask, sir." "No, don't bother." "They have taken the car to Howard's End," said the parlor-maid to Leonard. He thanked her, and asked whereabouts that place was. "You appear to want to know a good deal," she remarked. But Margaret had forbidden her to be mysterious. She told him against her better judgment that Howard's End was in Hertfordshire. "Is it a village, please?" "Village? It's Mr. Wilcox's private house, at least it's one of them. Mrs. Wilcox keeps her furniture there. Hilton is the village." "Yes, and when will they be back?" "Mr. Schlegel doesn't know. We can't know everything, can we?" She shut him out, and went to attend to the telephone, which was ringing furiously. He loitered away another night of agony. Confession grew more difficult. As soon as possible he went to bed. He watched a patch of moonlight cross the floor of their lodging, and, as sometimes happens when the mind is overtaxed, he fell asleep for the rest of the room, but kept awake for the patch of moonlight. Horrible. Then began one of those disintegrating dialogues. Part of him said, "Why horrible? It's ordinary light from the room." "But it moves." "So does the moon." "But it is a clenched fist." "Why not?" "But it is going to touch me. Let it." And seeming to gather motion, the patch ran up his blanket. Presently a blue snake appeared, then another parallel to it. "Is there life in the moon?" "Of course. But I thought it was uninhabited." "Not by time, death, judgment, and the smaller snakes." "Smaller snakes?" said Leonard indignantly, and aloud. "What a notion!" By a rending effort of the will he woke the rest of the room up. Jackie, the bed, their food, their clothes on the chair, gradually entered his consciousness, and the horror vanished outwards, like a ring that is spreading through water. "I say, Jackie, I'm going out for a bit." She was breathing regularly. The patch of light fell clear of the striped blanket, and began to cover the shawl that lay over her feet. Why had he been afraid? He went to the window, and saw that the moon was descending through a clear sky. He saw her volcanoes, and the bright expanses that a gracious error has named seas. They paled, for the sun, who had lit them up, was coming to light the earth. Sea of serenity, sea of tranquillity, ocean of the lunar storms, merged into one lucent drop, itself to slip into the sempiternal dawn. And he had been afraid of the moon. He dressed among the contending lights and went through his money. It was running low again, but enough for a return ticket to Hilton. As it clinked, Jackie opened her eyes. "Hello, Len. What ho, Len?" "What ho, Jackie. See you again later." She turned over and slept. The house was unlocked, their landlord being a salesman at Covent Garden. Leonard passed out and made his way down to the station. The train, though it did not start for an hour, was already drawn up at the end of the platform, and he lay down in it and slept. With the first jolt he was in daylight. They had left the gateways of King's Cross and were under blue sky. Tunnels followed, and after each the sky grew bluer, and from the embankment at Finsbury Park he had his first sight of the sun. It rolled along behind the eastern smokes, a wheel, whose fellow was the descending moon, and as yet it seemed the servant of the blue sky, not its lord. He dozed again. Over Tew Water it was day. To the left fell the shadow of the embankment and its arches. To the right Leonard saw up into the Tew woods and towards the church, with its wild legend of immortality. 6 forest trees, that is a fact, grow out of one of the graves in Tew churchyard. The grave's occupant, that is the legend, is an atheist, who declared that if God existed, 6 forest trees would grow out of her grave. These things in Hertfordshire, and farther afield lay the house of a hermit. Mrs. Wilcox had known him, who barred himself up, and wrote prophecies, and gave all he had to the poor. While, powdered in between, were the villas of business men, who saw life more steadily, though with the steadiness of the half-closed eye. Over all the sun was streaming, to all the birds were singing, to all the primroses were yellow and the speedwell blue, and the country, however they interpreted her, was uttering her cry of now. She did not free Leonard yet, and the knife plunged deeper into his heart as the train drew up at Hilton, but remorse had become beautiful. Hilton was asleep, or at the earliest breakfasting. Leonard noticed the contrast when he stepped out of it into the country. Here men had been up since dawn. Their hours were ruled, not by a London office, but by the movements of the crops and the sun. That they were men of the finest type only the sentimentalist can declare. But they kept to the life of daylight. They are England's hope. Clumsily they carry forward the torch of the sun, until such time as the nation sees fit to take it up. Half clodhopper, half school-board prig, they can still throw back to a nobler stock, and breed yeomen. At the chalk pit a motor passed him. In it was another type whom nature favors, the imperial. Healthy, ever in motion, it hopes to inherit the earth. It breeds as quickly as the yeoman, and as soundly. Strong is the temptation to acclaim it as a super-yeoman, who carries his country's virtue overseas. But the imperialist is not what he thinks or seems. He is a destroyer. He prepares the way for cosmopolitanism, and though his ambitions may be fulfilled, the earth that he inherits will be gray. To Leonard, intent on his private sin, there came the conviction of innate goodness elsewhere. It was not the optimism which he had been taught at school. Again and again must the drums tap, and the goblins stalk over the universe, before joy can be purged of the superficial. It was rather paradoxical, and arose from his sorrow. Death destroys a man, but the idea of death saves him. That is the best account of it that has yet been given. Squalor and tragedy can beckon to all that is great in us, and strengthen the wings of love. They can beckon, it is not certain that they will, for they are not love's servants. But they can beckon, and the knowledge of this incredible truth comforted him. As he approached the house, all thought stopped. Contradictory notions stood side by side in his mind. He was terrified, but happy; ashamed, but had done no sin. He knew the confession. Mrs. Wilcox, I have done wrong. But sunrise had robbed its meaning, and he felt rather on a supreme adventure. He entered a garden, steadied himself against a motor car that he found in it, found a door open and entered a house. Yes, it would be very easy. From a room to the left he heard voices, Margaret's amongst them. His own name was called aloud, and a man whom he had never seen said, "Oh, is he there? I am not surprised. I now thrash him within an inch of his life." "Mrs. Wilcox," said Leonard, "I have done wrong." The man took him by the collar and cried, "Bring me a stick." Women were screaming. A stick, very bright, descended. It hurt him, not where it descended, but in the heart. Books fell over him in a shower. Nothing had sense. "Get some water," commanded Charles, who had all through kept very calm. "He's shamming. Of course I only use the blade. Here, carry him out into the air." Thinking that he understood these things, Margaret obeyed him. They laid Leonard, who was dead, on the gravel. Helen poured water over him. "That's enough," said Charles. "Yes, murder's enough," said Chapter 42 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Howard's End by E.M. Forster. Chapter 42. When Charles left Ducie Street, he had caught the first train home, but had no inkling of the newest development until late at night. Then his father, who had dined alone, sent for him, and in very grave tones inquired for Margaret. "I don't know where she is, Pater," said Charles. "Dolly kept back dinner nearly an hour for her." "Tell me when she comes in." Another hour passed. The servants went to bed, and Charles visited his father again, to receive further instructions. Mrs. Wilcox had still not returned. "I'll sit up for her as late as you like, but she can hardly be coming. Isn't she stopping with her sister at the hotel?" "Perhaps," said Mr. Wilcox thoughtfully. "Perhaps." "Can I do anything for you, sir?" "Not tonight, my boy." Mr. Wilcox liked being called sir. He raised his eyes and gave his son more open a look of tenderness than he usually ventured. He saw Charles as little boy and strong man in one. Though his wife had proved unstable, his children were left to him. After midnight he tapped on Charles's door. "I can't sleep," he said. "I had better have a talk with you and get it over." He complained of the heat. Charles took him out into the garden, and they paced up and down in their dressing gowns. Charles became very quiet as the story unrolled. He had known all along that Margaret was as bad as her sister. "She will feel differently in the morning," said Mr. Wilcox, who had of course said nothing about Mrs. Bast. "But I cannot let this kind of thing continue without comment. I am morally certain that she is with her sister at Howard's End. The house is mine, and, Charles, it will be yours, and when I say that no one is to live there, I mean that no one is to live there. I won't have it." He looked angrily at the moon. "To my mind, this question is connected with something far greater, the rights of property itself." "Undoubtedly," said Charles. Mr. Wilcox linked his arm in his son's, but somehow liked him less as he told him more. "I don't want you to conclude that my wife and I had anything of the nature of a quarrel. She was only overwrought, as who would not be? I shall do all that I can for Helen, but on the understanding that they clear out of the house at once. Do you see? That is a sine qua non." "Then at 8 tomorrow I may go up in the car?" "8 or earlier. Say that you are acting as my representative, and of course use no violence, Charles." On the morrow, as Charles returned, leaving Leonard dead upon the gravel, it did not seem to him that he had used violence. Death was due to heart disease. His stepmother herself had said so, and even Miss Avery had acknowledged that he had only used the flat of the sword. On his way through the village he informed the police, who thanked him, and said there must be an inquest. He found his father in the garden shading his eyes from the sun. "It has been pretty horrible," said Charles gravely. "They were there, and they had the man up there with them too." "What? What man?" "I told you last night. His name was Bast." "My God! Is it possible? said Mr. Wilcox. "In your mother's house? Charles, in your mother's house?" "I know, Pater. That was what I felt. As a matter of fact, there is no need to trouble about the man. He was in the last stages of heart disease, and just before I could show him what I thought of him, he went off. The police are seeing about it at this moment."
Mr. Wilcox listened attentively.
"I got up there, it couldn't have been more than 7:30. The Avery woman was lighting a fire for them. They were still upstairs. I waited in the drawing-room. We were all moderately civil and collected, though I had my suspicions. I gave them your message, and Mrs. Wilcox said, 'Oh, yes, I see, yes,' in that way of hers."
"Nothing else?"
"I promised to tell you, with her love, that she was going to Germany with her sister this evening. That was all we had time for."
Mr. Wilcox seemed relieved.
"Because by then I suppose the man got tired of hiding, for suddenly Mrs. Wilcox screamed out his name. I recognized it, and I went for him in the hall. Was I right, Pater? I thought things were going a little too far."
"Right, my dear boy?
"I don't know. But he would have been no son of mine if you hadn't. Then he did just crumple up, as you said."
He shrunk from the simple word.
"He caught hold of the bookcase, which came down over him. So I merely put the sword down and carried him into the garden. We all thought he was shamming. However, he's dead, right enough. Awful business."
"Sword?" cried his father, with anxiety in his voice.
"What sword? Whose sword?" "A sword of theirs."
"What were you doing with it?"
"Well, didn't you see, Pater, I had to snatch up the first thing handy. I hadn't a riding whip or stick. I caught him once or twice over the shoulders with the flat of their old German sword."
"Then what?"
"He pulled over the bookcase, as I said, and fell,"
said Charles, with a sigh. It was no fun doing errands for his father, who was never quite satisfied.
"But the real cause was heart disease. Of that you're sure?" "That or a fit. However, we shall hear more than enough at the inquest on such unsavory topics."
They went into breakfast. Charles had a racking headache, consequent on motoring before food. He was also anxious about the future, reflecting that the police must detain Helen and Margaret for the inquest, and ferret the whole thing out. He saw himself obliged to leave Hilton. One could not afford to live near the scene of a scandal. It was not fair on one's wife. His comfort was that the pater's eyes were opened at last. There would be a horrible smash-up, and probably a separation from Margaret. Then they would all start again, more as they had been in his mother's time.
"I think I'll go round to the police station,"
said his father when breakfast was over.
"What for?"
cried Dolly, who had still not been told.
"Very well, sir. Which car will you have?"
"I think I'll walk."
"It's a good half-mile,"
said Charles, stepping into the garden.
"The sun's very hot for April. Shan't I take you up, and then perhaps a little spin round by Tuin?" "You go on as if I didn't know my own mind," said Mr. Wilcox fretfully. Charles hardened his mouth. "You young fellows' one idea is to get into a motor. I tell you I want to walk. I'm very fond of walking." "Oh, all right. I'm about the house if you want me for anything. I thought of not going up to the office today, if that is your wish."
"It is indeed, my boy," said Mr. Wilcox, and laid a hand on his sleeve. Charles did not like it. He was uneasy about his father, who did not seem himself this morning. There was a petulant touch about him, more like a woman. Could it be that he was growing old? The Wilcoxes were not lacking in affection. They had it royally, but they did not know how to use it. It was the talent in the napkin, and for a warm-hearted man, Charles had conveyed very little joy. As he watched his father shuffling up the road, he had a vague regret, a wish that something had been different somewhere, a wish, though he did not express it thus, that he had been taught to say "I" in his youth. He meant to make up for Margaret's defection,
but knew that his father had been very happy with her until yesterday. How had she done it? By some dishonest trick, no doubt, but how? Mr. Wilcox reappeared at 11, looking very tired. There was to be an inquest on Leonard's body tomorrow, and the police required his son to attend. "I expected that," said Charles. "I shall naturally."
Chapter 43 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Howard's End by E. M. Forster. Chapter 43. Out of the turmoil and horror that had begun with Aunt Julie's illness, and was not even to end with Leonard's death, it seemed impossible to Margaret that healthy life should re-emerge. Events succeeded in a logical, yet senseless train. People lost their humanity, and took values as arbitrary as those in a pack of playing cards. It was natural that Henry should do this, and cause Helen to do that, and then think her wrong for doing it. Natural that she herself should think him wrong. Natural that Leonard should want to know how Helen was, and come, and Charles be angry with him for coming. Natural, but unreal. In this jangle of causes and effects, what had become of their true selves? Here Leonard lay dead in the garden, from natural causes. Yet life was a deep, deep river, death a blue sky. Life was a house, death a wisp of hay, a flower, a tower. Life and death were anything and everything, except this ordered insanity, where the king takes the queen, and the ace the king. Ah, no. There was beauty and adventure behind, such as the man at her feet had yearned for. There was hope this side of the grave. There were truer relationships beyond the limits that fetter us now. As a prisoner looks up and sees stars beckoning, so she, from the turmoil and horror of those days, caught glimpses of the diviner wheels. And Helen, dumb with fright, but trying to keep calm for the child's sake, and Miss Avery, calm, but murmuring tenderly, "No one ever told the lad he'll have a child." They also reminded her that horror is not the end. To what ultimate harmony we tend she did not know, but there seemed great chance that a child would be born into the world, to take the great chances of beauty and adventure that the world offers. She moved through the sunlit garden, gathering narcissi, crimson-eyed and white. There was nothing else to be done. The time for telegrams and anger was over, and it seemed wisest that the hands of Leonard should be folded on his breast, and be filled with flowers. Here was the father, leave it at that. Let squalor be turned into tragedy, whose eyes are the stars, and whose hands hold the sunset and the dawn. And even the influx of officials, even the return of the doctor, vulgar and acute, could not shake her belief in the eternity of beauty. Science explained people, but could not understand them. After long centuries among the bones and muscles, it might be advancing to knowledge of the nerves, but this would never give understanding. One could open the heart to Mr. Mansbridge and his sort without discovering its secrets to them, for they wanted everything down in black and white, and black and white was exactly what they were left with. They questioned her closely about Charles. She never suspected why. Death had come, and the doctor agreed that it was due to heart disease. They asked to see her father's sword. She explained that Charles's anger was natural, but mistaken. Miserable questions about Leonard followed, all of which she answered unfalteringly. Then back to Charles again. "No doubt Mr. Wilcox may have induced death," she said, "but if it wasn't one thing it would have been another, as you yourselves know." At last they thanked her, and took the sword and the body down to Hilton. She began to pick up the books from the floor. Helen had gone to the farm.
It was the best place for her, since she had to wait for the inquest. Though, as if things were not hard enough, Madge and her husband had raised trouble. They did not see why they should receive the offscourings of Howard's End. And of course they were right. The whole world was going to be right, and simply avenge any brave talk against the conventions. Nothing matters, the Schlegels had said in the past, except one's self-respect and that of one's friends. When the time came, other things mattered terribly. However, Madge had yielded, and Helen was assured of peace for one day and night, and tomorrow she would return to Germany. As for herself, she determined to go too. No message came from Henry. Perhaps he expected her to apologize. Now that she had time to think over her own tragedy, she was unrepentant. She neither forgave him for his behavior nor wished to forgive him. Her speech to him seemed perfect. She would not have altered a word. It had to be uttered once in a life, to adjust the lopsidedness of the world. It was spoken not only to her husband, but to thousands of men like him, a protest against the inner darkness in high places that comes with a commercial age. Though he would build up his life without hers, she could not apologize. He had refused to connect on the clearest issue that can be laid before a man, and their love must take the consequences. No, there was nothing more to be done. They had tried not to go over the precipice, but perhaps the fall was inevitable. And it comforted her to think that the future was certainly inevitable. Cause and effect would go jangling forward to some goal, doubtless, but to none that she could imagine. At such moments the soul retires within, to float upon the bosom of a deeper stream, and has communion with the dead, and sees the world's glory not diminished, but different in kind to what she has supposed. She alters her focus until trivial things are blurred. Margaret had been tending this way all the winter. Leonard's death brought her to the goal. Alas, that Henry should fade away as reality emerged, and only her love for him should remain clear, stamped with his image like the cameos we rescue out of dreams. With unfaltering eye she traced his future. He would soon present a healthy mind to the world again, and what did he or the world care if he was rotten at the core? He would grow into a rich, jolly old man, at times a little sentimental about women, but emptying his glass with anyone. Tenacious of power, he would keep Charles and the rest dependent, and retire from business reluctantly and at an advanced age. He would settle down, though she could not realize this. In her eyes Henry was always moving, and causing others to move, until the ends of the earth met. But in time he must get too tired to move, and settle down. What next? The inevitable word, the release of the soul to its appropriate heaven. Would they meet in it? Margaret believed in immortality for herself. An eternal future had always seemed natural to her, and Henry believed in it for himself. Yet would they meet again? Are there not rather endless levels beyond the grave, as the theory that he had censured teaches? And his level, whether higher or lower, could it possibly be the same as hers? Thus gravely meditating, she was summoned by him. He sent up Crane in the motor. Other servants passed like water, but the chauffeur remained, though impertinent and disloyal. Margaret disliked Crane, and he knew it. "Is it the keys that Mr. Wilcox wants?" she asked. "He didn't say, madam." "You haven't any note for me?" "He didn't say, madam." After a moment's thought she locked up Howard's End. It was pitiable to see in it the stirrings of warmth that would be quenched forever. She raked out the fire that was blazing in the kitchen, and spread the coals in the gravelled yard. She closed the windows and drew the curtains. Henry would probably sell the place now. She was determined not to spare him, for nothing new had happened as far as they were concerned. Her mood might never have altered from yesterday evening. He was standing a little outside Charles's gate, and motioned the car to stop. When his wife got out, he said hoarsely, "I prefer to discuss things with you outside." "It will be more appropriate in the road, I am afraid," said Margaret. Did you get my message?"
"What about?"
"I am going to Germany with my sister. I must tell you now that I shall make it my permanent home. Our talk last night was more important than you have realized. I am unable to forgive you, and am leaving you."
"I am extremely tired," said Henry, in injured tones. "I have been walking about all the morning, and wish to sit down."
"Certainly, if you will consent to sit on the grass." The Great North Road should have been bordered all its length with glebe. Henry's kind had filched most of it. She moved to the scrap opposite, wherein were the 6 hills. They sat down on the farther side, so that they could not be seen by Charles or Dolly. "Here are your keys," said Margaret. She tossed them towards him. They fell on the sunlit slope of grass, and he did not pick them up.
"I have something to tell you," he said gently.
She knew this superficial gentleness, this confession of hastiness, that was only intended to enhance her admiration of the male. "I don't want to hear it," she replied. "My sister is going to be ill. My life is going to be with her now. We must manage to build up something, she and I and her child."
"Where are you going?"
"Munich. We start after the inquest, if she is not too ill."
"After the inquest?"
"Yes."
"Have you realized what the verdict at the inquest will be?"
"Yes, heart disease."
"No, my dear. Manslaughter."
Margaret drove her fingers through the grass. The hill beneath her moved as if it was alive.
"Manslaughter," repeated Mr. Wilcox. "Charles may go to prison. I dare not tell him. I don't know what to do. I'm broken. I'm ended."
No sudden warmth arose in her. She did not see that to break him was her only hope. She did not enfold the sufferer in her arms. But all through that day and the next, a new life began to move. The verdict was brought in. Charles was committed for trial. It was against all reason that he should be punished, but the law, being made in his image, sentenced him to 3 years' imprisonment. Then Henry's fortress gave way. He could bear no one but his wife. He shambled up to Margaret afterwards, and asked her to do what she could with him. She did what seemed easiest. Chapter 44 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Howard's End by E. M. Forster. Chapter 44. Tom's father was cutting the big meadow. He passed again and again amid whirring blades and sweet odors of grass, encompassing with narrowing circles the sacred center of the field. Tom was negotiating with Helen. "I haven't any idea," she replied. "Do you suppose baby may, Meg?" Margaret put down her work and regarded them absently. "What was that?" she asked. "Tom wants to know whether baby is old enough to play with hay." "I haven't the least notion," answered Margaret, and took up her work again. "Now, Tom, baby is not to stand. He is not to lie on his face. He is not to lie so that his head wags. He is not to be teased or tickled. And he is not to be cut into 2 or more pieces by the cutter. Will you be as careful as all that?" Tom held out his arms. "That child is a wonderful nursemaid," remarked Margaret. "He is fond of baby. That's why he does it," was Helen's answer. "They're going to be lifelong friends." "Starting at the ages of 6 and 1?" "Of course. It will be a great thing for Tom." "It may be a greater thing for baby." 14 months had passed, but Margaret still stopped at Howard's End. No better plan had occurred to her. The meadow was being recut, the great red poppies were reopening in the garden. July would follow with the little red poppies among the wheat, August with the cutting of the wheat. These little events would become part of her, year after year. Every summer she would fear lest the well should give out, every winter lest the pipes should freeze. Every westerly gale might blow the wych-elm down and bring the end of all things, and so she could not read or talk during a westerly gale. The air was tranquil now. She and her sister were sitting on the remains of Evie's rockery, where the lawn merged into the field. "What a time they all are," said Helen. "What can they be doing inside?" Margaret, who was growing less talkative, made no answer. The noise of the cutter came intermittently, like the breaking of waves. Close by them a man was preparing to scythe out one of the dell holes. "I wish Henry was out to enjoy this," said Helen. "This lovely weather, and to be shut up in the house. It's very hard." "It has to be," said Margaret. "The hay fever is his chief objection against living here, but he thinks it worth while. Meg, is or isn't he ill? I can't make out." "Not ill. Eternally tired. He has worked very hard all his life, and noticed nothing. Those are the people who collapse when they do notice a thing. I suppose he worries dreadfully about his part of the tangle." "Dreadfully. That is why I wish Dolly had not come too today. Still, he wanted them all to come. It has to be." "Why does he want them?" Margaret did not answer. "Meg, may I tell you something? I like Henry." "You'd be odd if you didn't," said Margaret. "I usen't to." "Usen't?" She lowered her eyes a moment to the black abyss of the past. They had crossed it, always excepting Leonard and Charles. They were building up a new life, obscure, yet gilded with tranquillity. Leonard was dead. Charles had 2 more years in prison. One usen't always to see clearly before that time. It was different now. "I like Henry because he does worry. And he likes you because you don't." Helen sighed. She seemed humiliated, and buried her face in her hands. After a time she said, "Above love," a transition less abrupt than it appeared. Margaret never stopped working. "I mean a woman's love for a man. I supposed I should hang my life on to that once, and was driven up and down and about as if something was worrying through me. But everything is peaceful now. I seem cured. That Herr Forstmeister, whom Frieda keeps writing about, must be a noble character, but he doesn't see that I shall never marry him or anyone. It isn't shame or mistrust of myself. I simply couldn't. I'm ended. I used to be so dreamy about a man's love as a girl, and think that for good or evil love must be the great thing. But it hasn't been. It has been itself a dream. Do you agree?" "I do not agree. I do not." "I ought to remember Leonard as my lover," said Helen, stepping down into the field. "I tempted him, and killed him, and it is surely the least I can do. I would like to throw out all my heart to Leonard on such an afternoon as this, but I cannot. It is no good pretending. I am forgetting him." Her eyes filled with tears. "How nothing seems to match! How my darling, my precious—" She broke off. "Tommy!" "Yes, please." "Baby's not to try and stand." "There's something wanting in me. I see you loving Henry and understanding him better daily, and I know that death wouldn't part you in the least. But
Is it some awful, appalling criminal defect?"
Margaret silenced her. She said, "It is only that people are far more different than is pretended. All over the world men and women are worrying because they cannot develop as they are supposed to develop. Here and there they have the matter out, and it comforts them. Don't fret yourself, Helen. Develop what you have. Love your child. I do not love children. I am thankful to have none. I can play with their beauty and charm, but that is all. Nothing real. Not one scrap of what there ought to be. And others go farther still, and move outside humanity altogether. A place, as well as a person, may catch the glow. Don't you see that all this leads to comfort in the end? It is part of the battle against sameness. Differences, eternal differences, planted by God in a single family, so that there may always be colour. Sorrow, perhaps, but colour in the daily grey. Then I can't have you worrying about Leonard. Don't drag in the personal when it will not come. Forget him, yes. Yes, but what has Leonard got out of life? Perhaps an adventure. Is that enough? Not for us, but for him." Helen took up a bunch of grass. She looked at the sorrel, and the red and white and yellow clover, and the Quaker grass, and the daisies, and the bents that composed it. She raised it to her face. "Is it sweetening yet?" asked Margaret. "No, only withered. It will sweeten tomorrow." Helen smiled. "Oh, Meg, you are a person," she said. "Think of the racket and torture this time last year. But now I couldn't stop unhappy if I tried. What a change! And all through you." "Oh, we merely settled down. You and Henry learnt to understand one another and to forgive, all through the autumn and the winter." "Yes, but who settled us down?" Margaret did not reply. The scything had begun, and she took off her pince-nez to watch it. "You," cried Helen. "You did it all, sweetest, though you're too stupid to see. Living here was your plan. I wanted you, he wanted you, and everyone said it was impossible, but you knew. Just think of our lives without you, Meg. I and baby with Monica, revolting by theory, he handed about from Dolly to Evie. But you picked up the pieces and made us a home. Can't it strike you, even for a moment, that your life has been heroic? Can't you remember the 2 months after Charles's arrest, when you began to act, and did all?" "You were both ill at the time," said Margaret. "I did the obvious things. I had 2 invalids to nurse. Here was a house, ready furnished, and empty. It was obvious. I didn't know myself it would turn into a permanent home. No doubt I have done a little towards straightening the tangle, but things that I can't phrase have helped me." "I hope it will be permanent," said Helen, drifting away to other thoughts. "I think so. There are moments when I feel Howard's End peculiarly our own. All the same, London's creeping." She pointed over the meadow, over 8 or 9 meadows, but at the end of them was a red rust. "You see that in Surrey, and even Hampshire now," she continued. "I can see it from the Purbeck Downs. And London is only part of something else, I'm afraid. Life's going to be melted down all over the world." Margaret knew that her sister spoke truly. Howard's End, Oniton, the Purbeck Downs, the Oderberge, were all survivals, and the melting pot was being prepared for them. Logically, they had no right to be alive. One's hope was in the weakness of logic. Were they possibly the earth beating time? Because a thing is going strong now, it need not go strong forever, she said. "This craze for motion is only set in during the last 100 years. It may be followed by a civilization that won't be a movement, because it will rest on the earth. All the signs are against it now, but I can't help hoping. And very early in the morning in the garden, I feel that our house is the future as well as the past." They turned and looked at it. Their own memories colored it now, for Helen's child had been born in the central room of the 9. Then Margaret said, "Oh, take care," for something moved behind the window of the hall, and the door opened. "The conclave's breaking at last. I'll go." It was Paul. Helen retreated with the children far into the field. Friendly voices greeted her. Margaret rose to encounter a man with a heavy black mustache. "My father has asked for you," he said with hostility. She took her work and followed him. "We have been talking business," he continued, "but I dare say you knew all about it beforehand." "Yes, I did." Clumsy of movement, for he had spent all his life in the saddle, Paul drove his foot against the paint of the front door. Mrs. Wilcox gave a little cry of annoyance. She did not like anything scratched. She stopped in the hall to take Dolly's boa and gloves out of a vase. Her husband was lying in a great leather armchair in the dining room, and by his side, holding his hand rather ostentatiously, was Evie. Dolly, dressed in purple, sat near the window. The room was a little dark and airless. They were obliged to keep it like this until the carting of the hay. Margaret joined the family without speaking. The 5 of them had met already at tea, and she knew quite well what was going to be said. Averse to wasting her time, she went on sewing. The clock struck 6. "Is this going to suit everyone?" said Henry in a weary voice. He used the old phrases, but their effect was unexpected and shadowy. "Because I don't want you all coming here later on and complaining that I have been unfair." "It's apparently got to suit us," said Paul. "I beg your pardon, my boy. You have only to speak, and I will leave the house to you instead." Paul frowned ill-temperedly, and began scratching at his arm. "As I have given up the outdoor life that suited me, and I have come home to look after the business, it's no good my settling down here," he said at last. "It's not really the country, and it's not the town." "Very well. Does my arrangement suit you, Evie?" "Of course, father." "And you, Dolly?" Dolly raised her faded little face, which sorrow could wither but not steady.
"Perfectly splendidly," she said. "I thought Charles wanted it for the boys, but last time I saw him he said no, because we cannot possibly live in this part of England again. Charles says we ought to change our name, but I cannot think what to, for Wilcox just suits Charles and me, and I can't think of any other name."
There was a general silence. Dolly looked nervously round, fearing that she had been inappropriate. Paul continued to scratch his arm. "Then I leave Howard's End to my wife, absolutely," said Henry, "and let everyone understand that. And after I am dead, let there be no jealousy and no surprise."
Margaret did not answer. There was something uncanny in her triumph. She, who had never expected to conquer anyone, had charged straight through these Wilcoxes and broken up their lives.
"In consequence, I leave my wife no money," said Henry. "That is her own wish. All that she would have had will be divided among you. I am also giving you a great deal in my lifetime, so that you may be independent of me. That is her wish, too. She also is giving away a great deal of money. She intends to diminish her income by half during the next 10 years. She intends, when she dies, to leave the house to her nephew, down in the field. Is that all clear? Does everyone understand?"
Paul rose to his feet. He was accustomed to natives, and very little shook him out of the Englishman. Feeling manly and cynical, he said,
"Down in the field?
Oh, come. I think we might have had the whole establishment, pickaninnies included."
Mrs. Cahill whispered, "Don't, Paul. You promised you'd take care." Feeling a woman of the world, she rose and prepared to take her leave. Her father kissed her.
"Good-bye, old girl," he said. "Don't you worry about me."
"Good-bye, Dad." Then it was Dolly's turn. Anxious to contribute, she laughed nervously and said, "Good-bye, Mr. Wilcox. It does seem curious that Mrs. Wilcox should have left Margaret Howard's End, and yet she gets it after all." From Evie came a sharply drawn breath. "Good-bye," she said to Margaret, and kissed her. And again fell the word, like the ebb of a dying sea. "Good-bye."
"Good-bye, Dolly."
"So long, father."
"Good-bye, my boy. Always take care of yourself."
"Good-bye, Mrs. Wilcox." "Good-bye." Margaret saw their visitors to the gate. Then she returned to her husband and laid her head in his hands. He was pitiably tired. But Dolly's remark had interested her. At last she said, "Could you tell me, Henry, what was that about Mrs. Wilcox having left me Howard's End?" Tranquilly he replied,
"Yes, she did. But that is a very old story. When she was ill, and you were so kind to her, she wanted to make you some return, and, not being herself at the time, scribbled Howard's End on a piece of paper. I went into it thoroughly, and as it was clearly fanciful, I set it aside, little knowing what my Margaret would be to me in the future." Margaret was silent. Something shook her life in its inmost recesses, and she shivered. "I didn't do wrong, did I?"
he asked, bending down. "You didn't, darling. Nothing has been done wrong." From the garden came laughter.
"Here they are at last,"
exclaimed Henry, disengaging himself with a smile. Helen rushed into the gloom, holding Tom by one hand and carrying her baby on the other. There were shouts of infectious joy. "The field's cut," Helen cried excitedly. "The big meadow. We've seen to the very end, and it'll be such a crop of hay as never." Weybridge, 1908